Hi, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas on Sunday, January the 27th, and welcome to our video commentary. Well, today we're going to go back to 1973, January 27th, 1973. It was on this day that Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and the representative of North Vietnam, as well as the Viet Cong, signed the agreement, the peace agreement that eventually ended the Vietnam War. And then the next day, President Nixon formally presented the agreement to the American people, and it went into effect over the next few months. One of the important parts of the agreement, of course, was the release of the prisoners of war, the POWs, and that was one of the first things that happened immediately. The troops began to come home, and by March or the beginning of April, the POWs had come back home. One of these POWs, as many of you may know, was John McCain, Senator John McCain, who was a senator as well as a candidate for president. The reason that the agreement was eventually signed is because during the Christmas or during the holiday season of 1972, President Nixon became very serious with North Vietnam, and he authorized the bombing of North Vietnamese military facilities as well as the ports, and it became a very tough response. And I think the Vietnamese realized at that point, the North Vietnamese realized at that point that Nixon was dead serious and was not going to play games. He had just been reelected by 49 states, so he had a lot of political power, and that he would use that political power to finish the war, which he did. Now, for many people, of course, Vietnam is just something out of the history books. The war, I guess, formally began for the United States in the 1960s. There were troops in Vietnam when President Kennedy was assassinated here in Dallas, Texas. But it really didn't take off until a few years later when President Johnson escalated the conflict. And at one time, the United States had as much as 500,000 troops in Vietnam. It became a very complicated and unpopular war for much of the American public. When Nixon became president, he put into place something called Vietnamization. And over the next 4 years, the number of American troops began to drop considerably. And on election day in 1972, I think there were maybe 10 or 15,000 troops in Vietnam. Much of the fighting was actually being done by the South Vietnamese. The United States still had the air power to support the South, but most of the American troops had already come home. So by the time the agreement was signed, it was basically the POWs up in Vietnam who had not come home, and they did shortly after. In retrospect, it was a great victory, this agreement for the United States. It ended an unpopular war, but it ended the war protecting South Vietnam. Unfortunately, about 2 years later, South Vietnam collapsed, and it's now part of the whole Vietnam. And the reason it collapses to a great extent is because the United States, the Democrats in the Congress basically pulled back any support for the South. So the South was basically left by itself and was overrun by a much bigger and more powerful North Vietnam. So it was a good day on this day in 1973, but it was a very unhappy ending a couple of years later in May of 1975. The best book that I have ever read about Vietnam was written by President Nixon himself after he left office. He wrote a book called No More Vietnams, in which he outlined how we got in and how we got out. And he used the example of Vietnam as how not to fight a war, how never again to fight a war. And that's why the name of the book is No More Vietnams. I would really recommend that book, especially if you're interested in that time frame, the 60s and the 70s. Thank you for watching. We have all of these on YouTube, we have them on Twitter, and we have them on my blog. And if today is your birthday, happy birthday. Bye-bye, everybody.